I want to talk to you this morning a few minutes about the religious dimensions of the pandemic. And this is based on not necessarily your beliefs, but based on beliefs of a lot of other people. The first issue is this: what is God's role in this pandemic? You know, historically, a lot of people felt that emergencies or disasters were God's wish, and God was punishing a society. And that's been true for millennia. In the modern era, you recall the HIV epidemic. There were a lot of people who said, well, God is punishing the gay community for the gay lifestyle. Hurricane Katrina, you recall, Pat Robertson had some problems with New Orleans and a lot of Black people having a lot of fun with music. You know, that didn't seem to go well with him. And so he felt God was punishing New Orleans. I don't think you're going to hear that this time, partly because it affects everyone. You know, there's no particular group to blame. You can't blame Mexicans, you can't blame immigrants. Everybody is being affected by this. So I think it never made any sense to say that God was punishing people for these natural disasters. And maybe we'll learn something through this, because this natural disaster is really affecting everyone. And if it pushes the world in that direction, then I think it's a good development. Another dimension, a religious dimension, is what about intelligent design? You recall intelligent design, the idea is this, that evolution just cannot explain how complex organisms are. You know, flowers are so amazingly beautiful and complex. Even an individual cell is amazing. You know, it's got a membrane, it's got a nucleus, it's really a complex structure. And individual molecules are really amazingly complex. Chemical reactions. Could that have all been the result of natural selection and randomness? Well, that's the scientific view. That's the consensus scientific view. Of course, you know, Christian conservatives cannot deal with that. So they think that there must be some intelligent design behind all this. Could there be intelligent design behind COVID-19? I mean, why would God create this very nasty, deadly virus to go infect people? And would God have made people vulnerable to the infection of it? You know, 100,000 people dead in the United States alone. It doesn't seem it's possible that any omniscient, loving God would do that. Therefore, I think it's good evidence that the intelligent design idea about how we came to be and how organisms came to be just doesn't make any sense. Another dimension that I think is worth thinking about is how do you find meaning in the face of something like this? You know, 100,000 people dead in the United States, many hundreds of thousands of people around the world. And we didn't do anything to deserve it. You know, it's unearned suffering. It's suffering that just descended upon us. So how do you find meaning in the face of that? Well, it depends on, I think, your personal religion, if you have a personal religion, or your personal philosophy. And you could be driven to the position that, well, gee, the world has no sense of justice. There's no sense of order. It's just chaotic randomness. There is no meaning there, and you can't find any meaning there. And I think that if you look for meaning historically, if you look for meaning externally, you're not going to find it, because there is no meaning out there. It is meaningless. If you look at the universe and looking for meaning externally, where does the meaning come from? It comes from you. It comes internally. So how do you find meaning in the face of this? Well, it's hard to do that. I agree. This is a pretty disastrous series of events. But I think in the case of anything like this, first you have to have courage. You know, you look for courage from inside that gives you the strength to deal with it. And you have courage to think, I'm going to get through this. This will be over at some point. And then you look around to see other ways of finding meaning. And one way is to see if you can help. Now, helping yourself is important. I don't want to dismiss that. So taking care of yourself, loving yourself, finding a way to protect yourself through this, you can find meaning in that. If you have the opportunity and you have the ability to do it, you can go help other people. And I think it's a pretty unusual situation and pretty heroic situation. Think about people who are on the front lines of this, you know, healthcare workers and first responders that are out there, people in the grocery stores, checking out our goods and helping us get food, you know, wearing their masks, showing up every day to do that. So they are really helping. I don't expect everybody can do that, but looking around for taking care of yourself, taking care of others when you can, I think is another way of finding meaning in this. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is what this virus has to say about the place of humans in the universe. So let's go back to basics about what viruses are. They're a very unusual thing. You know, they're not a living organism. They are a little speck of genetic material, sometimes RNA, sometimes DNA. COVID-19 happens to be in DNA. But they're not a complete genotype that would lead to a self-sustaining organization. They're not as complex as a bacteria, for example. They don't have a cell membrane. They don't have a nucleus. They're just a little clump of genetic material. They're not independent. Therefore, they're parasites. The only way they survive is to invade another organism. And then what they do, they survive by attaching themselves to the DNA of the organism that they invade. And then they drive that organism to replicate the virus. And then the genetic code that they bring to that cell forces replication. Now, viruses have been around for millennia, more than that, probably since soon, you know, life began on Earth probably 3.5 billion years ago. I don't know when viruses started, but probably not soon, so long after that. There's a controversy about how they started. Did they evolve on their own? Were they a breakaway from an established organism? And then they became this little clump of material, genetic material that survived independently. So it's unclear where they come from, but they're with us. Hundreds of thousands of viruses are around in the earth, and probably for hundreds of millions of years. Only a few hundred of them have the chemical structure to invade human beings and cause the damage that this one does. Now, we've only approached them scientifically in the last century. You know, for millennia, the humans have dealt with viruses probably just by hunkering down and living through them. That's what we did with the Spanish flu. That's what we did with the plague. That's what we did with lots of viruses in the past. Now we understand them scientifically, and we're able to cope with it to some extent. Now, what does it tell us about the role of humans in the earth? You know, and well, let's think about the possibilities of extinction. There have been billions of species that have existed since life, or began on Earth 3.5 billion years ago. 99% of those species are extinct. How long do species last? Well, it varies. Sometimes the average is said to be between 1 and 10 million years, but most species will become extinct, including human beings. So we have to think about the fact that human beings are like any other species. You know, humans evolved, let's say Homo sapiens was around 200,000 years ago. We had our predecessors, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Neanderthals, which survived fairly long and kind of to overlap. I mean, these species overlapped with Homo sapiens, but eventually they became extinct. Now, where am I going with this? Well, imagine a virus that's worse than COVID-19. You know, it's more contagious. It has a higher fatality rate. Could we become extinct from it? You bet. The human species could become extinct. Now, how do we wrap our mind around that in thinking about the role of humans on our planet? Well, what I think it suggests to us is that if there were some omniscient God who picked humans to be the supreme species to rule over the face of the earth, we would be missing the actual biological history of all species. The fact is, our species may not be around, and almost certainly will not be around forever. That's for sure. Whether we got it 10,000 years or 100,000 years or 1,000,000 years, I don't know. But what does that tell us? Well, what does that tell us about the nature of God? I think what it tells us is that if we look for a God that has a specific ideology that it wants human beings to follow, and that it only favors human beings that follow that ideology, that's a destructive path, because that's what leads to religious conflict. Now, I'm not saying you can't have a conception of God. Maybe you can have a conception of God. I do, because I use that term to mean the spirit of love in the world. But that's not a notion of God that has a specific ideology. That doesn't lead to the exclusivity problem, that some people are favored and some people are not. So maybe this will push us somewhat in the direction of a universal conception of God, which is more spiritual, more open, more loving. So again, that doesn't mean we reject the conception of God. It just means we reject a conception of God doesn't lead us to the exclusivity problem. We open ourselves up to treasuring all other human beings, and we don't find ourselves in these pointless religious ideological conflicts. All right, well, thank you very much. I hope this worked, and I hope everyone is safe and well.